Buongiorno e benvenuti in questa avventura che dalla
Good
vista
morning
ci
and
condurrà alla
welcome
visione.
to this
Che cos'è
adventure
questo
that is
percorso? È la
going to
storia di
move
Mido,
from
ma nello stesso
eyesight to
tempo è la
vision.
storia
What
di
is
un'Italia
this
e del
path?
mondo
It
che
is
in
a
questi
story of
60
Mido, but at
anni,
the
dal
same time, it is a story
1959,
of
l'anno di
Italy
nascita di
and the
Mido,
world
ad
in the
oggi,
70
ha
years
davvero attraversato, lo
from
vedremo,
1959 when
onde
Mido was
diverse
born
di
up to the
immaginario
present
collettivo,
day.
di
That has
epoche
gone through
assolutamente
different waves
diversificate,
of
e il mio
collective
ruolo è un po'
imagination,
quello di
of
Virgilio, di
eras and
portarvi
epochs
in
that
questo
were
mondo che è
highly
stato il
diversified.
cielo,
And my role is
purgatorio e
that of
paradiso a
Virgil
seconda dei
to
momenti, e la
walk
cosa più
you through
importante
this
intanto è
world
chiarire perché
that
dalla
has been
vista alla visione.
heaven,
Gli
purgatory, or
anni
hell, depending on the
60
moment.
sono
But the
stati
very first
anni
thing is to
di
clarify
cultura
why
materiale,
from
no? Il termine
eyesight to
tecnico è
vision. The
questo, e
60s
cioè
were
anni in
years
cui il
of
mondo del consumo, il
material
mondo
culture.
di
That
ciò
is
che
a
ci
technical term. That
circondava
is to
era
say, years
davvero già un
when the
marchio, era
world
qualcosa di
of
molto
consumption,
chiaro,
the
di molto
world that
visibile, che
surrounded us,
corrispondeva
was
ad una grande
already a
crescita,
brand,
a
was
una
something
crescita
very
demografica,
visible,
una
very
crescita economica,
clear,
una
and it
crescita
went hand
sociale,
in
e quindi
hand
erano anni
with the
in cui
demographic, economic,
guardare,
and social
vedere
growth.
corrispondeva
So
già a
those were
un'avventura,
years where
perché eravamo
seeing,
nel pieno
looking,
dell'entusiasmo
was
di
already
questa
some
vita
sort
che
of an
cambiava.
adventure
Parlo
because
dell'Italia, ma parlo anche di tanti altri
enthusiasm was
paesi, e
booming, our
sicuramente
life was
l'American
changing.
Dream, no? Il
I'm
mondo
referring
degli
to
anni
Italy, but
60
I'm also
americani,
referring to many other countries.
costituiva il
The
punto di
American
riferimento per il
dream,
resto del mondo, e quindi
that
la
was a
vista
reference point
corrispondeva
for
a
the
questo
rest of the
mettere a
world.
fuoco, ed anche
And
il mondo
so
di Mido, anche il mondo
eyesight
dell'occhialeria in quegli
was the
anni
idea
era
of
impegnato
focusing, and also
nel
the world of Mino,
ridefinire
the
anche
eyewear world,
tecnicamente, e
was
con
committed
elementi di
to
grande innovazione,
redefining, even
questa necessità.
technically,
Diamo
with the
luce
elements of
al
great
mondo che
innovation,
possiamo
this new
vedere, no?
need.
Quindi qualcosa di molto
Let's give
legato
light
alla
to the
dimensione
world
materiale.
that we
Mano a
can
mano che
see,
andremo
so something
avanti, e vedremo, questa
extremely
dimensione
related to the material
performativa,
dimension.
legata
But
cioè
over
a
the
questa
years,
necessità di
this
vedere,
performance
diventa
related
qualcosa di
dimension
nuovo, qualcosa di
that was
diverso. Già nel
connected to
ventennio
the need to
successivo, dagli anni
see
80
becomes
agli anni
something new,
2000,
something different.
arriva un
Already
modo
in the next
nuovo di
20 years,
osservare il
from the
mondo,
80s to the
si apre a punti
2000s,
di vista che sono nuovi,
a
che
new
sono
way to look
diversi,
at the
che sono
world
ad esempio
starts
quelli della
taking
moda,
shape that
che comincia a
opens up to
frammentarsi,
new
che comincia a
viewpoints. For instance,
distinguere i
the
diversi
viewpoint of
stili, e
fashion, which
ciascuno poi
becomes
con il suo stile di
fragmented
vita doveva
and which
scegliere
starts to
se
define new
fosse
styles,
King-Cato
and
Armani
each
o
one
Dolce
with his
Gabbana
own
per
lifestyle had to choose
costruire ad
whether
esempio
maybe
la propria
Armani or Dolce
immagine, no? La
Gabbana
propria
was
apparenza.
more
E così
suitable to
arriviamo
build up
agli anni 2000. Negli anni
their own
2000
image and
questo
their
mondo così
look.
materiale,
So we
legato ai
get to the year
consumi, legato ad
2000.
a
Now,
una
this
dimensione
very material
visibile,
world, so related to
subisce davvero una grande
consumption,
svolta,
so
che è la
related to a
svolta della new
visible
economy, che è la
dimension,
svolta del
goes
digitale, che è la svolta
through
dell'industria
changes, big
materiale.
changes.
Allora, in un
It's a
mondo
turning point, the turning
immateriale
point of
non
new
possiamo più
economy, the turning point of
accontentarci di
digital,
costruire
the
dei riferimenti che
immaterial
sono
world. In an
visibili e
immaterial world,
materiali, ed è
we can no
lì
longer be
che la sfida
satisfied
della
with building
vista si
visible
trasforma
material
nella visione,
references.
cioè nella
And
capacità
here,
di
the
immaginare
challenge
mondi che
of
ancora non esistono,
eyesight
proprio perché il
transforms
digitale
into
permette
vision, the
questa
capability of
elasticità,
imagining
e quindi
worlds
tutto
that
diventa
still
anche più
do not exist
personale.
because
C'è
the
il
digital
modo
world is so
personale,
flexible, so
soggettivo,
everything becomes
innovativo,
more
che va
personal.
a definire
There's a
degli
personal,
stili che non sono più
subjective,
solo gli stili di vita, ma
innovative
sono gli
way
stili di
that goes
pensiero,
to
cioè il modo in
define
cui sia
certain styles, no
consumatori che
longer
imprenditori,
lifestyles, but
che
styles of
buyer, che
thinking, the
espositori.
way that
Parliamo
both
evidentemente della
consumers,
tendenza Mido,
entrepreneurs, buyers,
dell'affrontare per
exhibitors,
poter
obviously I'm
ridisegnare
referring to
il
the
futuro e
middle
anche il successo
community,
economico. Quindi
have to
entriamo
cope with
davvero
in
in un
order
altro
to be able
mondo,
to
e
retrace and
questo mondo arriva
redesign
fino
the
ad oggi,
future
e
and
arriva con
economic
delle
success.
modalità
So it
che
is a
sono in
completely
qualche
new
caso anche
world, a world
traumatiche.
that
Questa
reaches up to the
presentazione che voi
present day,
vedrete è stata
and
concepita e realizzata
it has
nel
materialized in a
2019, alla
dramatic
fine del
way. And my
2019 è stata
presentation, the
pensata
current
per
presentation,
festeggiare e celebrare i
was
60 anni di
prepared at the
Mido,
end of
e quindi pur
2019 in
mantenendo
order to
ferma questa
celebrate the 60
dimensione che
years
è quella
of
visionaria,
Mido. So,
singolare e collettiva,
without
non
affecting
avevamo
this
vissuto il
visionary
trauma
dimension,
della
the
pandemia, questo
individual and
stress
collective one,
test
we
che ci
still
ha in
hadn't
qualche
gone
modo
through the trauma of the
costretto anche ad
pandemic.
approfondire
This
alcuni
stress
elementi
test that
vitali, no?
somehow
Legati alla nostra
forced us
sopravvivenza, alla
to
necessità
explore
di
more in
essere parte
depth
di una
some vital
comunità, quindi
elements that are
elementi
related to
nuovi che
our
emergono,
survival,
eppure
to
Le
the need to be
parole chiave
part
che
of
noi
a
avevamo già
community. So
individuato,
new emerging
all'evidenza erano
elements.
spirito
But
del
still, the
tempo,
key words that
paradigm
we have
shift,
already
quindi grande cambiamento
identified
anche
were
radicale, e
spirit
modo
of the time,
condiviso. Queste
paradigm
erano parole
shift,
già nel
so a
2019
radical
abbastanza chiare per
change
noi che
and
studiamo
sharing.
la
Those
società,
were
e
words
oggi
that
lo vedremo alla
were
fine negli
already
ultimi
very
slide,
clear in
questo viene
2019
confermato.
for
Ecco,
people
il
like me who study
1959 è anche l'anno
society.
in cui
And
nasce la
all this
Barbie.
has
È
been
l'unico
confirmed.
esempio che
And in fact,
propongo in
1959
apertura,
was a
perché
year
con la
when
Barbie
when
non
the
nasce
Barbie
solo
doll
una
was
bambola
launched.
o un nuovo prodotto
And with the
per i
Barbie
bambini e
doll,
le bambine,
that is
ma
not
nasce
only,
un modo di guardare al
a
mondo
new
e che
Barbie.
è
It's not a
legato,
plaything
diciamo,
for
alla
children, but it's a
modernità.
new
Gli anni
way
60
to
sono gli
look at the
anni in cui si
world that is
progetta la
linked
modernità,
to
lo si fa col
modernity.
design,
The
pensate
60s
allo
are
straordinario
the
successo
years
del
where
design italiano in
modernity
quegli
is
anni,
planned
lo si
and
fa con la
conceived
tecnica
through
che non è la
design. Think of
tecnologia
the
come
enormous
la
success of
immaginiamo
Italian
oggi,
design in
ma
those
è
years.
qualcosa di
You
ancora più
conceive modernity
aspirazionale, no?
with
La tecnica sempre partendo
technique, not
dagli
with
Stati Uniti
technology. It's something
diventa
very
una sorta di sogno,
aspirational,
no?
that
E
technique.
permette delle
Starting out from the
soluzioni
United
che
States,
fanno
the
sognare, che
technique
ci
becomes a
lanciano in mondi
dream
completamente
and
nuovi,
affords
prima la televisione,
solutions
poi
that
tutto quello
makes you
che
dream
seguirà,
and that
e quindi è una
project you
tecnica
into
che ci
new worlds
sostiene in
from the
questa dimensione
TV
di grande
onward. So it is a technique
partecipazione
that
al sogno
supports
collettivo,
us
che è
in
anche
this new
evidentemente un gioco
dimension, a
aspirazionale,
dimension of
cioè negli anni
sharing a
60
collective dream,
diciamo
which
che
obviously it
il
is an
gioco
aspirational
sociale della
game.
piramide
In the
dell'essere povero,
60s,
ricco
the
e della
social
invidia
game
successo era
of the
molto chiaro, e
pyramid of
quindi
being
se
either
potevi
poor or
partecipavi
rich
e lo
and the idea
facevi
of
a tuo
pursuing
modo. Anche
success,
l'acquisto di
everything
un
was very
500
clear.
poteva
If you
essere
could,
un
you would
gradino di questa
participate in
scala
any way.
verso
For
il
instance, a
successo.
purchase of
Quindi
a
il sistema è
Fiat
molto chiaro.
500 car
Lì si
could
utilizzava
be, a step
l'ascensore,
in
no? Per
this
salire
ladder
nella
to,
propria condizione
to get
sociale, ed era,
to
lo
become
ripeto,
successful. You
tutto molto
use
chiaro,
the
tutto molto
elevator
definito.
to
Quindi
expand
consumo
your
al centro,
social
la
status,
dimensione di
and everything was
modernità,
extremely
il
clear and
gioco
well defined.
aspirazionale,
Everything
già, e
revolved
quindi
around
Marilyn Monroe,
consumption, the
Art e
dimension
Miller,
of
che
modernity, the
rappresentano in
aspirational
qualche
game.
modo in quegli anni
Here,
la coppia di
Marilyn
riferimento. Ci fu la
Monroe and
Botticelli
Arthur Miller,
con
who
Jacqueline,
back
ma
then
diciamo che in qualche modo
represented
questa
the reference
dimensione
couple,
è
together with Bob Kennedy
davvero
and Jacqueline
il
Kennedy.
taglio che in
So
quegli
this
anni viene in qualche modo
dimension
fatto per
was truly
appartenere
the
ad una
way
società che
that
aveva dei valori molto
in
chiari.
those
Già negli anni
years was
70 le cose
used
cominciano
in order
a
to
cambiare
belong to a society
profondamente.
that
Alla fine degli
had
anni 60,
very
lo
clear
sappiamo,
values. In the
assistiamo
70s,
alla
things
rivoluzione
started to
generazionale, al grande
change
conflitto, al 68, al
considerably.
69,
At,
vengono
at the
messi in
end of the
discussione
60s,
quei
there is a
valori
big
di
generational conflict. The
appartenenza ad un
68,
mondo dei consumi,
1969,
e
those
passiamo
values
dalla
of belonging
prosperità
to a
alla
consumption
prosperità,
world
e
are
tutto
questioned,
diventa molto
are
più secco,
challenged,
molto più
and we move
tagliente.
from
Anche gli
prosperity
stili degli
to
anni 70,
austerity.
come
Everything
ricordate, sono molto più
becomes
decisi. Il
keener,
mondo della
becomes more
tecnologia continua ad
sober.
avanzare, ma lo
Even the
fa
styles
in
are
modo
totally
completamente
different. The
diverso.
world
Non
of
è più
technology
l'appartenere al
continues to
sogno,
move
ma è anche
forward,
di
but in a
definire,
completely
diciamo, una
different
dimensione
way.
critica
It is
della
no longer the
società.
idea of
E
belonging to a dream, but
sicuramente
it's the
John
idea
Lennon è
of
uno dei
defining
personaggi che con i
critical,
suoi
you
occhialini, che
know,
diventano
being
un'icona, per
critical of
cui farò
society. And if you
riprendere gli
look here
occhialini
at John
Gramsci,
Lennon
vanno a
with
riprendere
his
una dimensione
small
anche culturale e
glasses,
ideologica
which become
molto
an
precisa
icon,
di
w-
critica alla
which
società, ma nello
conjure
stesso
up the
tempo
idea of
anche di
Gramsci, so
sostegno
the
per un sogno
idea of
collettivo
a
che
critique
nella
of society,
canzone
but at
icona
the
di quegli
same
anni,
time, the support of a
Imagine,
collective
cioè
dream, which
sicuramente ci
in his
restituisce
cult
questa
song,
dimensione collettiva nuova.
Imagine,
Nello stesso tempo
definitely,
la moda non è
definitely
più unita,
reflects
non è più
this new collective
omologante, ma
dimension. At the
comincia a
same time,
differenziarsi. Per
fashion is
cui
no longer the same for
sicuramente
all
Pierre
people, but
Cardin, che è
starts
uno
to
dei maghi
differentiate
della moda di
itself.
quegli anni,
And so, for instance,
contrappone
Pierre
all'occhialino
Cardin,
di
one of the
John
best
Lennon
interpreters of fashion in
le
those
prime
years,
forme di
just
maschera del
opposes
corpo
to the John
attraverso le sue
Lennon's
visioni.
small
Il mondo della
glasses,
moda è un
the
mondo molto
first
separato, molto
forms of
lontano da
body
quello della critica
shapes,
sociale.
body
Cominciamo ad
masks.
assistere a
The
queste
fashion
dimensioni
world
alternative,
is
dove
is a
tutto
world
è
that is
comunque
very
ancora molto
distant
chiaro.
from the
Ci può essere
world
di destra o di
of
sinistra, ci può
social
essere con
critique.
l'Eskimo
So
o con il
everything
bomber,
is
ma
still relatively clear.
questa,
However,
diciamo,
despite these
dimensione di
juxtapositions, you
contrapposizione,
could
di
be left
conflitto,
winged or
si è
right
terminato
winged. But
tragicamente negli
so
anni,
there
ad esempio
was
in
an
Italia, con gli anni
idea
di piombo,
of
e quindi può
conflict
essere come in
that
un
is
altro mondo rispetto
tragically
a
expressed in Italy, for instance, in the years of lead. So it's a completely different world from the happy world in the previous decade. So there are many substantial changes in the transition from one decade to the other. In the meantime, Mido proposes its competence, opens up to the world, starts having international importance, and Italy reaffirms its role as the unrivaled leader in the world of constructing beauty, fashion, and style. And this dimension of artistic items, artistic objects, gets mixed up with the business world. So the business world starts to get injected with strong doses of creativity. So we have to remember that because this will lead us to the next decade, the decade of hedonism, all round hedonism. That means getting back, stepping back into your private world. The committed world of politics and ideology steps back, and what emerges is a personal, individual, collective gratification. Those are the years where there is more mobility that gets expressed through these images, where an opportunity to get personal pleasure becomes essential, together with the big theme of nomadism and mobility. So not only very young people, but also normal, ordinary people learn to travel, to get around, and they do that by furnishing and enriching their experience with new products like the Walkman, products that make your experience more pleasant. This is an important step. Big icons emerge in the 80s in that landscape that someone ironically defined as Reagan's hedonism. Margaret Thatcher claimed that only individuals exist. There is no social fabric. Personal and individual needs are the primary objective. It is clear that Tom Cruise, with that image, he becomes an icon. Obviously, even Richard Gere becomes an icon by proposing the Armani's style in movies. Those are the years where several different disciplines meet, but always in the direction of hedonism or pleasure. Grace Jones, she becomes an icon, an explosive icon of those years, but the entire star system starts participating in this big game where the explosion of the body, that later on will become seduction, is somehow considered the route to go, the route that everyone would like to embark upon. So, this idea of following a road that comes after the 60s, after the 70s, that fought a lot in terms of values in the 80s, even in Italy. Let's not forget that. Early in the 80s, George Armani was defined the man of the year in the Time magazine front cover. Those are the years of the Italian style of fashion. Mido participates, takes part in this big celebration, and fully understands that this does not only relate to the happy few in the fashion world. And so here we see all of the different professions, all of the different jobs, even the most simple jobs, which become protagonists through the choice of a frame, of an accessory, of a pair of glasses, and by exposing yourself. So this is a pathway that stops with Berlin's wall fall, and we moved into a new world. In fact, early in the 90s, we see other values, completely different values. First of all, anxiety. Why anxiety? Because you realize that you have too much at your disposal. So performance anxiety becomes a key element. So people taking part in this big game no longer do that in a lighthearted it happy way, but they have lots of concerns defending your credibility. And because of that, we immediately understand that the huge success of the fashion model season will define some new female models that cannot be reached, that are not attainable. It's an experience that is presented by the media, by front covers, but it is far too much for ordinary people. Ordinary people cannot compete with those models. That is a losing battle from the start. So we start seeing some preliminary cracks in that model of the 80s that gets to the 90s. The recognized icons in the fashion system, but in the star system in general, become fashion models, but that reference model is far too ambitious, and people truly risk to lose their battle. At the same time, something else happens. This is the start of the digital world, of a world that is no longer that visible, that invades our daily dimension. Today, talking about Tamagotchi may raise a smile because it was some sort of a childish game, but so many adults got addicted and were hooked up. And the idea that there is another world, which is a digital world that is just about to invade us, that proposes alternatives in a very democratic and accessible way, another opportunity, that to imagine worlds that may satisfy our needs that otherwise would remain unfilled. So it's some sort of a reprocessing, so redefining in a universal way our life logic. So we get at the end of the 90s, you will remember the millennium bug, the big fear. Everybody was scared about a blackout. It was a groundless fear. But after a few months, we had the September 11 attack in 2001, the collapse, the demise of a vertical power model. And unfortunately, what starts is the era of fear, of protection, of a desire for security. And so we see anxiety, we see collective fears, and these experiences that apparently seem to be capable of going on indefinitely, without boundaries, without frontiers. It seemed to be a happy ending, but at the end of the day, the world appeared to be much more complicated, much more complex. And the new challenge through the digital world is proposed through this new model, which is a model of seduction discipline. Paris Hilton, in those years, did not only become an icon, a star, but tangible proof that through this very powerful combination between what you are and what you look and what you appear and what you say. Obviously, there were no social media, but digital presence started to become important. Through all of that, you can permanently seduce your audience. And as Andy Warhol had foreseen in the past, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes in his life. Now we understand that each of us would like to be famous throughout their entire life. So this dimension of seduction, of permanent seduction, of exposure becomes the rule, becomes a norm. And the idea underlying all that is speed, acceleration, is performance. So we get back to the performance of the 60s, but we do that in an even more powerful way. On a daily basis, we demand that all of our needs are immediately met. So we want a fast solution to all of our needs. This is called snap performance, like snapping your fingers, something that at the end allows you to be continuously successful, to stay ahead of the curve. So those are the years of backpacks, of high fashion backpacks that follow you in your daily activities, because our life has become frantic. We're always in the fast lane. and we commute a lot, permanent commuting. So we need to have with us everything that we need to perform to our best and to measure up to other people's expectations. This idea of an immediate answer will have an impact on new technologies that at the end of the day provide new aesthetics. Look in the 70s, technique becomes a source of aesthetics. iPod, for instance, is the first object signed by Apple, which follows this story of aesthetic transformation and defines a new script, some new rules. In fact, it gets imitated in all other industries. The idea of a touch screen, the idea of being able to govern a world that is invisible and that can be retrieved and called up whenever we need it. So it's this dimension of a permanent service that is truly at the service of our desires and of our whims. And this object will influence all others in our daily life. So, Mido, the eyewear industry, so your community gets invaded by all of these needs. And we have to pursue and we have to provide an answer. We have to meet all of these technical solutions, all of these technical expectations, expectations that are also related to performance. So pursuing the idea of good eyesight as back in the 60s is no longer enough because too many new elements are now at stake and at play. And in fact, in 2010, at the end, what emerges is a true need. The true need is self coding. That is to say, each of us is going to code their own reality, which is designed around you, around your experiences. So, in the eyewear industry, initially, for instance, it gets seduced by this assumption of self coding. For instance, just remember Google Glasses. That was a big failure because, however, that was a big failure because that was going too far. Self coding cannot influence your vision in such a frantic way, being able to observe reality and at the same time continuing to receive new information from all over the world. This is crazy. That appears to be too much. It's a hyper choice that is synonymous with non choice. We're no longer capable of discerning, of selecting, or sorting out. So, this is one of those experimentation activities that is carried out on a permanent basis. Those are years of innovation, of the idea of immortality. That is to say, there are some boundaries that are being stretched, but there are also many, many setbacks and steps back. Google Glass is a step back like robotics, where despite the fact that robotics is an important industry, we have finally understood that those are useful technological advances for very specific purposes. Robotics, for instance, is used in the medical industry. So we're not talking about robots that can keep you company and can be with you. Today, robots and robotics has found so many interesting applications, and the same is true for Google, for what Google Glass represents. But at the same time, from 2010 to 2020, were years where thinking big was a key element. Thinking big means creating new worlds. It means imagining new services. So just think of Spotify, of Netflix. Just think of the four big tech major companies. So you understand when you work in that dimension that everything is possible. And we can set our own limits, our own boundaries that should not be overstepped. But especially some American entrepreneurs decided to overstep some boundaries. Elon Musk imagining trips to Mars. So this dimension should should not be demonized, but it should be understood. It's human nature that continuously moves in the direction of exploration, discovering something impossible. Although uh, in doing so, we're losing some pieces. We'll lose the awareness that we're made of flesh and blood and that we have our own limits that we have to respect. So, one of the things that emerges at the end of that decade is a redefinition of our gender, of our sexuality, of our presence in the world. Uh, and all this is no longer related to the big challenge of technology or to the challenge of artificial intelligence, which was considered the boundary before. So, before the pandemic, we have seen a couple of years where the focus was more on human aspect, this gender dimension, this reshuffling card, feminine, masculine, also in terms of style. New rules have been written, interesting ones, because they are psychologically and socially relevant. And so you start realizing that maybe the big challenge that we have to measure up to today is not only that of artificial intelligence, which may appear stupid simply because artificial intelligence is all about calculation, whereas true human intelligence, even if you look at the etymology of the word intelligence, understanding, discerning, choosing between. This is something that machines will never be able to do. It's up to the human being to choose. Artificial intelligence calculates with enormous power, and so it can win a chance game, but it will never win the game of life, which is still firmly in our hands. So, this new dimension where the challenge is personal. Each one wants to code their own path. We have different visions, all round visions, this idea of thinking big, which is so important. We have to tap into those big challenges, but at the same time, we have to think about ourselves and about our essential values. And that's why we, 2 years ago, we imagine three different paths. The first one is where smartness, intelligence, the intelligence that technology makes available to us, uh, it, it is an important asset, but we have to steer it, we have to guide it, we have to cope with the true challenges. And after the pandemic, we have understood what are the true challenges. Second path, we have to abandon or to review this excessively narcissistic dimension. We're not at the center of the world. We have to understand that there is a need to share. Sharing is so important because that allows us to, cope with a community of destiny. We're all involved in certain dynamics. I mean, the pandemic has hit us all. So, getting back to what Pope Francis explained to the world extremely well, we're all on the same boat. So, we have to uh, put our collective intelligence to the best use. We have to nourish the new paradigms. And because of we started out from material culture and we get to a material culture of experimentation, of innovation with new materials. So this is an important path that we will have to explore more in depth in the future. So these already 2 years ago were the big challenges that had to be tackled. Pandemic struck, everything has changed, but in reality, nothing has changed because this scenario that moved from one decade to the other with some keywords will lead us to this matrix that after the pandemic shows us these values, these images, those are the values that we have to commit ourselves to as individuals, as businessmen, as community, as the world of culture. We have understood certain things in this lockdown year, a year of reflection, because since we had, fewer things to do, and we had more things to think about today without a vision. So eyesight is not enough. We need to work with projects for which we have to become responsible. We have to conceive a new vision, not only for our industry, but a collective vision that has to be shared. We have to do that with competence and with knowledge, because these, together with the scientific dimension, are the two dimensions that saved us. So the idea of sharing information, and at the same time, we have to redefine new leadership forms that can choose and that can involve and engage people, and not to impose things onto us. This is no longer feasible today. So forms of leaderships with a lot of empathy. And also, Italy is also playing a very central role, probably because Italy was the most hit country in the Western world. But we have shown that despite our limitations, we're still alive, that we can react strongly. And I think in the next few years and next few months, this will be reconfirmed again, like in the post-war reconstruction Italy. Let's try to follow that road again, and let's follow two very simple but complicated indications. Augmented beauty, because today people who have left the nightmare of pandemic behind will desire things that have missed. The beauty of products, the beauty of objects, the beauty of services. Beauty is a new way of life that outside Italy is called the Italian way. So we need to explore that a little bit more in depth. We need to become more aware of that. That will be the starting point. But at the same time, we have to do that with the other magic word that does not belong to us, which is augmented ethics. We need to define some essential values, because when augmented reality, thanks to technology, will continue to be our scenario, ethics, shared values will guide us. We will need sustainability. Sustainability, obviously, environmental sustainability, but also sustainability of the human race. There will be a game of excellence to be played. Excellence is not luxury, it's making things better than all others. Excelling means getting the best out of us with that element of community responsibility, that dramatic image of the coffins transported away from the military trucks in Bergamo, that is firmly implanted in our mind. These are the big challenges, and so we need to respond to those challenges with strategies. This concerns media community, but also concerns politics, your own personal vision, education, anything that suffers so much today. There is a Green New Deal that we have to embrace. We understood it already a few years ago, but this is now a universal assumption. We will move in that direction at least for the next 20 years. Also, let's talk about generational alliances, which is strategic, because generational alliances see very young kids, so-called Z generation, shares sustainability, environmental values, which are the same as their grandparents. In fact, the boomers invented and fueled the vision of ecology, of environmental protection, that today is called sustainability. So those kids can teach their parents or grandparents what it is to live in a digital world. And the digital world goes through generational alliance, and not through stupid training courses for the elderly who need to learn how to use a PC. That happened during the pandemic and may continue to happen. A stable economy will join social economy. It is fundamental to have an intercultural connection. For instance, the research on vaccines was implemented by the scientific community by exchanging information in all countries, and then each of the several countries try to, design the final product. So this is an element that has to be protected, because a common good and public health cannot be restricted to a single country, cannot remain within the boundary of a country, but it should be something collective. We have a lot of trust in science and long-term vision. Only a long-term vision will allow us to cope with these big, big challenges, challenges that are here to stay with us. And my last words today: alone, you're not going anywhere. This is a clear indication that Pope Francis gave us. So it is a world of trust and of hope, because we have to invest in hope. Hope is not the easy optimism, everything will turn out right, because nothing turned out right, unfortunately. But hope is a great engine, a great driver that is synonymous with our vision of life, and hope comes from our capability to forge new alliances between us, between disciplines, between generations. The Great New Deal is all about this, and it is with this word that I would like to conclude, and I hope we will be able to work well together.